I'm going to go ahead and get started here in just a second. I got to keep riding this horse because my goal is to be getting done with John by April or May, and at the rate we're going, it's going to be a challenge. But I think the good news is that we're coming into some material that I think we're a lot more familiar with. I think chapter 11 that we embark on today is part of a story that you know well. Chapter 12 you're probably a little less familiar with. Chapter 13 is, 13 pretty well. 18, 19, and 20, and probably 21 are also chapters that you're going to recognize and know quite a bit. And we've really had to slog through some tough material these last several chapters. And yes, I never rush through much of anything in a class setting, but I really appreciate the fact that from this point forward, I think I'll be able to focus in on some selected parts rather than having to go through it as exhaustively as we have, because you're familiar with a lot of the material now. But, okay, so today we hit chapter 12, and I'm sorry, chapter 11. And chapter 11 and 12 sort of form a single unit, and this is Jesus is making his way back to Jerusalem again for his final Passover, and of course for the Passion, his death, his burial, his resurrection. We have just concluded chapter 10, which was the discussion of, first of all, it began with the discussion of the shepherd and his flock, and then we talked about the incidents surrounding the celebration of Hanukkah, and that the Jews were once again offended deeply at what Jesus had to say. They tried to stone him, they tried to arrest him, but at the end of chapter 10, Jesus has retreated back to the area where this whole story began in the first place. By the time we get to chapter 11, we don't know the exact timing, but now Jesus is embarking upon his final journey to Jerusalem. So what have we learned from chapters 5 through 10? This was an important section, and really what we saw was this series of confrontations between himself and the religious authorities in Jerusalem. And what I want you to sort of be framing in your mind is this notion of the difference in Jesus' reception based upon where he was. And this becomes very clear in the Gospel of John as you contrast it with the Synoptic Gospels. And in the Gospel of John, as we said from the very beginning, it's filled with conflict because Jesus is always headed to Jerusalem. And so Jerusalem, Judea, the southern part of Palestine, is the area where every time Jesus goes there, there's trouble. Okay, and there's conflict, and there's division, and there's discord. Up in the other regions, in the regions of Galilee, there's a lot more popular support for Jesus. There's a lot more acceptance of his message. We read through the Synoptic Gospels of his ministry in Galilee, which isn't described much in John at all. But in the Synoptic Gospels, we see miracle after miracle after miracle. Whereas in John, there's really a limited number of miracles performed, and we'll be looking at that at some point in the future as well. So understand that there's this geographic tension between the two different areas of Jesus' ministry. Okay, and then the result is that we have this giant divide that has now been defined between himself and his enemies. There have been multiple attempts now to take Jesus. They've tried to capture him. They've tried to stone him. They're trying to kill him. All those are part of the equation for what they want to do to Jesus. And it's not only Jesus, this hatred is also extending to Jesus' disciples and his followers. And you can recall that in chapter 9, the blind man that was healed, after he is healed, he's thrown out of the synagogue. He's essentially excommunicated from Jewish life. And so there are these incredible tensions building, not just for Jesus, but also to his followers, and we're going to see that. Now, what should we be looking for moving forward as we work our way through these next chapters and even to the end of the book? Well, first of all, the hatred of Jesus begins to crystallize into a concrete plan to assassinate him. Okay, so that's one thing that we need to see. And this is no longer going to be just on religious grounds. Up until this point, the reasons for killing Jesus have been religious, and the fact that they view Jesus as being guilty over and over and over again of blasphemy. But now they're going to develop some political reasons to kill Jesus, and that's going to happen in the course of chapter 11. The other thing to watch for as we work our way, oops. There, no, that wasn't it either. Come on. Yeah, there we go. The other thing to keep our, did I just go dead? Yes, you did. Hello? Okay. The other thing to watch for as we work our way forward is that Jesus shifts his focus. And we're going to see that now he begins to turn his attention to his friends and his disciples, where so far in the gospel, much of his energy has been consumed by his confrontations with his enemies. But now we're going to see a great shift in this, and of course this is the period now, he only has a few weeks left until he's done. And so he's preparing them for two important things. Number one, he's got to prepare them for the fact that he's going to die shortly. He's going to go through a tremendous persecution and crucifixion and a trial, and they're not going to understand that. So he's got to get them ready for the days ahead when they're going to face that. But also, he's got to have the long range in mind, because he's got to prepare them for the years ahead, for the decades ahead, because the success or failure of the kingdom rests on their shoulders and what they do with this. So Jesus has a lot of work to do in preparing them to carry on the mission of God. So here's where we are as we look at chapters 11 and 12 in this final movement that he makes as he works his way back to Jerusalem for the final scene. We see in chapter 11, most of chapter 11 occurs in a little town near Jerusalem called Bethany, at the home or in the locale where Lazarus, Mary, and Martha lived. And while there, Jesus raises Lazarus from the dead, and then once again he has to retreat. At the tail end of chapter 11 and then into chapter 8, we see Jesus once more returning to Bethany, and there he is anointed by Mary, okay, in preparation for his burial. Then next in chapter 12, we're going to see Jesus enter into Jerusalem, and this is the triumphal entry, of course, which you're so familiar with. Later in chapter 12, he is going to be in Jerusalem, and he's going to announce the glorification that is about to take place. And actually, God himself is going to make an appearance there too. At least he's going to speak, and the crowd is going to hear evidence of his voice. And then as chapter 12 concludes, there's a bit of a retrospective or a review of what has taken place to date, as John sort of sets the first half of the book aside and then opens, in chapter 13, he'll open the second half of the book, is what it boils down to. So, today we begin into chapter 11, and this is, as I mentioned, this takes place in Bethany. It's the Lazarus affair is what I'm calling it. And one thing that you're also going to want to keep your eye on is watch the effect of this, not just the events
that occur in chapter 11. But watch how this affects things as we work our way through chapter 12 and into chapter 13. Because I think you'll be surprised at how much this miracle affected the powers that be, and how Lazarus himself, his presence became a threat to the authorities, just like Jesus, okay? So watch for that as we work our way through this. This is the climax of Jesus' miracles and his ministry, really. We see in this miracle, in this resurrection, in this interaction with Lazarus and his family, we see a unique combination of Jesus being both human and having human friendships, but also being divine and possessing the authority and the power that God has given to him. So, and then also think about this as being a foreshadowing of what's coming, because the gospel obviously isn't going to end with the resurrection of Lazarus. The important thing is yet to come. But this is laying the groundwork for Jesus' own resurrection, which then is obviously the focal point of the whole story. The other thing to keep your eye on as we're working our way through here is the big picture, the overall situation. Watch, as we've mentioned, at how people are reacting to Jesus. Many are coming to faith and coming to believe in him. But on the other hand, this raising of Lazarus also becomes the catalyst for the death sentence that ultimately takes his life. The resurrection of Lazarus guarantees the death of Jesus. Let me say that again. The resurrection of Lazarus guarantees the death of Jesus. And then watch for this hatred to spill over, not just aimed at Jesus, but also to his followers. Now I need to clear one thing up before we get into the text of Luke 16, and I'll just mention this, or before we get into the text of John chapter 11. And that is that this account of Lazarus being raised from the dead is often linked to the story of Lazarus and the rich man, which Jesus told in Luke 16, 19 through 31. And part of the reason that there's a linkage that's sometimes made is because, remember, at the end of that story of the rich man and Lazarus, the rich man asked Lazarus to let him go, or to go warn his brothers, right? And the rich man says, if someone from the dead goes to warn them, they'll repent. And then Abraham replies to the rich man, if they don't listen to Moses and the prophets, they'll not be convinced, even if someone rises from the dead. And so some people have seen that mention of a Lazarus who could rise from the dead, who does rise from the dead, and has the possibility of this mission, and then they link that to the Lazarus of John 11. But there's really no reason to make that linkage. Number one, we don't know if Jesus was telling fact or fiction when he talked about the rich man and Lazarus. Many people view this as a parable, which means it really has no grounds in reality, but other people view it as an actual account that Jesus is talking about. We don't know. The Bible doesn't tell us if this is a real event and a real sequence of things, or if this is actually a parable that he is using to teach with. The Lazarus of Luke does not look like the same Lazarus here in chapter 11. The Lazarus of Luke, remember, is described as an invalid who begged at the table of the master. That doesn't sound like Lazarus. It sounds like Lazarus, Mary, and Martha had a home in Bethany. It doesn't seem like these two men would have connected. Don't forget, Luke was written well before John. And so when Luke wrote about that, what Jesus had taught, he had no knowledge that John would later on talk about a man named Lazarus. So Luke didn't know that this was going to be discussed, and Luke, in fact, may not have even known about Lazarus who was resurrected. He may not have even known that fact. Go ahead, Jerry. Well, there's a lot of reasons that it seems a little bit of a stretch, doesn't it? It seems a stretch to believe that they're one and the same. And finally, the last thing I'll mention is that Lazarus was a very common name in the first century. Lazarus, I mean, it's just like John. Now, Lazarus is derived from the word Eliezer. And Eliezer was a very common name, especially in the line of the priesthood, because that was one of the sons of Aaron of old. So Eliezer was a very common name, and Lazarus is a derivative of Eliezer. So there's really no reason to connect these two stories as having involved the same man and the same person, even though this Lazarus of John's record is resurrected. So let's get into the text now, and we'll take a look at the first section here, verses 1 through 16, wherein the death of Lazarus ultimately is reported to Jesus. And so let's read 1 through 16 quickly. Now a man named Lazarus was sick. He was from Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. This Mary, whose brother Lazarus now lay sick, was the same one who poured perfume on the Lord and wiped his feet with her hair. So the sisters sent word to Jesus, "Lord, the one you love is sick." And when he heard this, Jesus said, "This sickness will not end in death. No, it is for God's glory, so that God's Son may be glorified through it." Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. Yet when he heard that Lazarus was sick, he stayed where he was for 2 more days. And then he said to his disciples, "Let's go back to Judea." "But Rabbi," they said, "a short while ago the Jews tried to stone you, and yet you're going back there?" And Jesus answered, "Are there not 12 hours of daylight? A man who walks by day will not stumble, for he sees by this world's light. It's when he walks by night that he stumbles, for he has no light." And after he had said this, he went on to tell them, "Our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I'm going there to wake him up." His disciples replied, "Lord, if he sleeps, he will get better." Jesus had been speaking of his death, but his disciples thought he meant natural sleep. So then he told them plainly, "Lazarus is dead. And for your sake, I'm glad I was not there, so that you may believe. But let us go to him." And then Thomas, called Didymus, said to the rest of the disciples, "Let us also go, that we may die with him." Good old Thomas. Okay, so let's work our way through this. Verses 1 through 3 tell us the location of this sequence of events. This is Bethany. Bethany is a little town on the outskirts of Jerusalem. According to verse 18, it's less than 2 miles from Jerusalem proper. So this is a suburb, is what it boils down to. It probably wasn't contiguous, because remember, cities back in those days usually had walls and things as defensive structures. So it probably wasn't contiguous, but yet it was close enough that there was a lot of interaction between what went on in Bethany and what went on in Jerusalem. We will come back to this same household in chapter 12, and that is where the anointing will take place by Mary, but that's yet to come. These verses 1 through 3 also identify the 3 siblings. They tell us, okay, there was Lazarus, there was Mary, and there was Martha. In verse 2, John further identifies Mary as being the one who had anointed Jesus' feet. Now, the interesting thing is this hasn't happened yet. That doesn't happen until chapter 12. But remember, when John writes this, it was in the past, because he didn't write this until about 90 A.D. So this is in the past, and he can reference Mary, even though he hasn't included her in the gospel yet. He can reference her because of the history that would have been known, especially to Jewish people. In verse 3, the sisters send word to Jesus. And notice the description. They say, "the one that you love." And so there's this special, tender relationship between Jesus and Lazarus that we know nothing about. Okay? And this is one of those points where, we just have to take it on face value for what's told to us. We don't know the history of this. We don't know anything about Lazarus other than what's told us right here. In verse 5, we're going to learn that he loved all three. So chances are he had met with them, talked with them, stayed with them, taught them, and they had developed a very, very significant bond over the years. The only other thing we really know about this household is what Paul preached about last Sunday, and that's the event back in Luke chapter 10, verses 38 through 42, where Jesus came into their home to teach, and Martha had one set of priorities and Mary had another. Okay? And so that's really all that we know about them, are what happens here in chapter 11, chapter 12, where Mary anoints his feet, and then back in Luke chapter 10. So we don't know a lot about the characters here. Verse 4, Jesus responds to this news that Lazarus is sick, and he responds with a word of prophecy about what's going to happen and what's going to take place. And he says, this sickness will not end in death. Now, he's not saying that death won't happen.
Right.
And in fact, we're going to see he delays his coming so that death is guaranteed to happen. Okay? And so he's making sure, double sure, that this is going to happen. But what he's saying is it won't end there. This will not end in death. But put yourself in the ears of the disciples. What would they have thought from this? When Jesus said, this sickness will not end in death, they would have thought Lazarus is never going to die. Or at least from this, he's not going to die. He's going to be okay from this. So imagine their surprise, their disappointment, when Jesus later tells them plainly Lazarus is dead. Now what's that do for Jesus' credibility in the eyes of his disciples? There's a little test of faith here, isn't there? Yeah, absolutely. Go ahead, Ron.
Another miracle.
Bingo. Yep, you never know what's coming next, do you, with Jesus? So, all right, now, verse 4 is also interesting because it tells us the reason for Lazarus' sickness. And what was it? To point out God's glory, to bring credit to him. And this should remind us of John chapter 9. Remember, that was the man born blind. And remember what Jesus said the purpose for his being born blind was? It was so that the power of God might be made obvious in his life. And so these things that happen that are against what we initially want or think can result in great glorification for God. Jerry?
Just a thought. Lazarus probably had other ailments, but when he was risen from the dead, everything was whole. He was alive. He was pure. And that's the way we'll be when we're risen from the dead.
All right, so there's a spiritual analogy. We don't know Lazarus' condition when he raised from the dead, other than he was alive. We don't know about the other infirmities that he had and everything else. We don't know the state of his body, except that it worked. And that's good enough for me. Right?
And the
After 4
disciples,
days, absolutely.
Yeah, yeah,
and the disciples were able to witness again.
yeah.
It seemed they needed these lessons continuously so that it all made sense when Jesus did.
It's easy for doubt to creep in, is it not?
Absolutely,
And isn't that the message of our lives too?
yes.
You know, we go from one thing to the next, to the next, to the next, and we'll have something happen that, man, I can't figure out the purpose here. What are you trying to show me now, Lord? And what can I learn from this? And maybe I don't figure that out for months or years, but eventually it'll become clear. It'll become clear. Go ahead, Patty.
Just a quick story. My sister's husband was converted by my husband. He was a fellow doctoral student at Indiana University. And he got sick and ended up in the hospital. Long story short, his heart was only functioning at about 5%. So they told them, either we take you to Mayo Clinic, this is 1985, or you're not going to make it. He called
James 5. Very good. Thank you. Thank you. This is a reminder to us that God can use the worst of circumstances to show himself. And Paul talked about that. You remember when he asked 3 times to have his infirmity taken away? And what was it, the answer? What was the answer that came back to him? My grace is sufficient and my power is made perfect in your weakness, or in weakness. Okay, and if you need the verse, that's 2 Corinthians 12, verse 9. Don't ever forget that. Verses 5 and 6 here in John chapter 11 show us both the human side of Jesus and the divine side of Jesus. Verse 5 tells us about his humanity. He loves his friends. And of course, there had to be a tension in his heart as he watches what's going on and knows what's going on and is aware that he can help Lazarus even right now. But according to verse 6, he waits 2 days. And that had to be God pulling on the other side of his heart saying, just wait. Just wait. There's a greater purpose here than going out and solving that problem now. There's a greater witness. There's a greater chance to cement and build faith in these disciples, these fledglings, who are the real goal of what's going on. Go ahead, Lamar.
You would think a little bit of that would have kind of crept into their mind by the fact that when he received the word, it was no big deal to him.
Yeah.
He had like, well, I already know this. It's getting ready to happen. Not already do I know it, I'm getting ready to tell you how it's going to turn out and why. And that should have gave them a clue to the power of Jesus right there before he even did anything.
It seems like they don't get it, though, until retrospectively. And I understand that because let's put a body here that's been dead for 4 days. What do you think? It's over. I mean, it's done, period. And overcoming that is huge.
But he's raised people.
He's done it before. He has already raised at least 2 people from the dead, right?
You can tell from Thomas's words, Thomas thinks they're all going to die.
Yeah.
So we'll go ahead with Jesus and we'll die with him.
And this will be the end for us, too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So at that moment, Thomas.
I see it today, Annie.
Same thing goes with us today. All this behind us. We see, we've read about it. We know that it happened.
Yeah.
But we do the same thing over and over again.
That's right. That's right.
We don't change. We haven't changed.
So in verse 6, Jesus waits 2 more days. Notice the word in verse 6, yet. And that tells us that there's this tension going on. There's this part of him that wants to go because of his love, but something else is holding him back. And there are 2 things ultimately that happen because he waits those 2 additional days. Number 1, Lazarus is definitely dead. And we learn in verse 39 that he's now, by the time Jesus arrives, he's been dead for 4 days. But the other thing that happens is by the time Jesus arrives in Bethany now, a bunch of mourners have come out from Jerusalem. So Jesus' audience in Bethany is much larger and much greater and gives him the opportunity to foster belief, to bring about faith in more people. And so that is also operating in the background, that God is working this thing, right? In verse 7, Jesus proposes that they return to Judea. Now, interestingly, he doesn't say anything about going to Bethany. And he also doesn't say anything about going to Lazarus. He just says, let's go back to Judea. Well, they've just fled Judea because why? They wanted to kill him. They tried to stone him. And so now he proposes, let's go back to Judea. And in verse 8, the disciples react as humans with fear because they remind him of the danger and the previous attempts on his life. Jesus answers them in verses 9 and 10 with a statement that there's urgency. There's no time to waste here. The time is limited. Daylight is ending. Okay? Why is the time limited? What's the limitation on the time that Jesus is talking about?
He's drawing close to his death.
Jesus is getting ready for himself to die, and he will be leaving. He is the light that will be leaving, the light that will be ending. The 12 hours of light will shift to hours of darkness. That is the light that he's talking about that will be leaving. Maybe they thought that Lazarus didn't have much time left. That's possible too. So, in an answer to that, Jesus goes on with the rest of the story in verses 11 through 15 and tells them Jesus is dead. He starts out by saying he's asleep, but then he has to go ahead and tell them, no, he's dead. We don't know how Jesus found out about this. Was this a miraculous knowledge transfer, or were there messengers that came and told you? We don't know. But initially he told them that Lazarus was asleep. In the Jewish context, this is important because for a Jew, sleep was a sign that they were recovering from illness. The throes of the illness are now over. You can rest and you can get well and get your strength back. So when Jesus said he's asleep, that's why they react, well, he's going to get better. We don't have to go back to Judea and risk our lives. Okay? And that's why they react the way that they do. But nonetheless, Jesus goes on to tell them that, no, he's dead. He's gone. Verse 15, Jesus gives the main reason for his 2-day delay and why he now is going. What is that? What's Jesus say in verse 15 is the reason for their faith. This is all about their faith. And this is where, as we talked about the shift in the gospel is now shifting to draw the attention to what he's doing to strengthen his followers, his disciples, and fit them for the task that's ahead of them. And it's their faith that initially will change the world. Verse 16, we get our first glimpse of Thomas. Thomas will become maybe, and this is interesting, he may become the key figure of John's gospel. Because the climax of John's gospel is when doubting Thomas becomes faithful Thomas.
That's right.
That is the ultimate pinnacle of this whole gospel, is Thomas coming to faith. So Thomas is somebody we need to pay attention to, but Thomas is the realist. He always is. He's the one who wouldn't accept the stories of Jesus. He had to see it with his own eyes and touch it with his own hands. And here he expresses what everybody had to be thinking. We are going to die when we go back to Judea with Jesus. Now, the interesting thing that I've thought about over the years in verse 16 is the last word, at least the way, I'm not sure how the other translations word it, but the NIV says, let us also go that we may die with him. Who's the him? Jesus? Could it be Lazarus? Yeah, I've gone back and forth over that over the years. I'm not sure. I tend to believe that it's probably Jesus, because Lazarus is already dead, and the text says, let us go that we may die with him. That's possible, but I can also see there's room there for that also to refer to Lazarus. But here's the point that I realized in this study. It doesn't matter.
As well,
It could.
it has to be Jesus the way he's stated it. Because let us also go that we may die as well. They already know Lazarus is dead, but with him.
Okay.
And maybe
It's the act of dying or the act of being dead. I mean, that's the challenge. Go ahead, Patty. You got something?
The New American Standard, I don't know if you know this, but it capitalizes the pronouns.
Some versions capitalize it, some don't.
Okay, and it did capitalize it in mine.
Okay.
It's got it capitalized.
But of course, that's not a Greek thing. That's an English nuance and rests upon the interpretation of who's reading it. Lamar?
You know, when you look at the conversation of Thomas, he's directing this at the other disciples.
Yeah.
So it's almost as if they're making a decision if they're going to go back with him and risk their lives. And that's when Thomas, I believe, says,
Yeah.
well, let's just go die with him. we've gone this far, let's just die.
And that's the direction I tend to go with this as well. I don't know that I could say it 100% with 100% certainty, but here's the thing, it doesn't matter. The point for Thomas is, and the other disciples, they all think they're going to die, no matter whether they're going to die with Jesus or whether they're going to die with Lazarus, or be dead with Lazarus.
Right.
Go ahead, Lamar, one more.
What just hit me, when you just said all this, is that we start our walk as Thomas.
Oh, yeah.
And that's the beautiful part of Thomas in the story. We're all Thomas at some point in time when we come to faith and believe. Now we are converted as Thomas was.
This is where we're going to end when we get done with chapter 11, is we're going to take a look at some of these different people that we have identified through just this story and the different points of faith they're at. And we identify with every single one of them in one way or another. And they each have messages and lessons for it that are incredible. But this is the first glimpse that we have of Thomas. Ooh. I'm wondering if I can get started into the next section, or if I should just wait. I can't get through it. I'm going to wait. We're going to pick up next week with verses 17 through 27, and here's where we will be headed. We will see Jesus' arrival in Bethany, and then his conversation with Martha. And I'm going to leave you with this thought. What we're going to, and challenge you to read this, but what we're going to see from Martha is that Martha, it's interesting, in the story Paul told us from Luke, it was Mary who seemed to have the greater spiritual understanding. It flips here. We see Martha's making statements here that Mary doesn't make. And Martha comes to a point of faith that's really remarkable. But here's the thing. Martha comes to a point of faith in Jesus that I will follow you. I don't understand everything, Jesus, but I will go. I will go with you. And it's another one of those things that's really a message for us. The message is, we can't understand it all. We don't know it all. But will you follow? Will you trust? And that's what it's all about. And that's where Martha goes in these next verses. So watch for that. I encourage you to read more. And next week we'll pick up with verse 17. God is good?
All the time.
All the time.